Okay, let's get underway. So welcome to this webinar. Um, my name's Tom Barraclough. I think I know many of you, but I'll sort of cover off me and my co-founder, Hamish Fraser, who you can also see on the call with us. I'll tell you a little bit about us shortly. But essentially what I'm going to run you through today is the work that we've been doing both in a kind of research context and a public policy context, and then also in terms of actual development. So we're developing software, we're developing digital outputs in order to put them to use. I'm going to run through a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to tell you about us. I'm going to run you through a report that we published in the MIT Computational Law report, which was really exciting for me as a bit of a geek in both law and computer stuff. I'm going to give you an example of the kind of approach to digital legal systems that we describe in the report. And then I'm going to illustrate how we're sort of taking the approach that we are through the kinds of tools that we're developing. And then I'm going to run you through some immediate opportunities that I see for actually putting our tools to use, because it's all very well and good to talk about these things in the abstract, but it's another thing to relate them to something that I'm sure many of you will be dealing with in your day-to-day work. So as I mentioned, I'm recording this session. I'm going to distribute the slides afterwards to all the attendees, and you can feel free to send those on to others who couldn't make it. We aren't operating a chat today. We've got a little bit to get through, and what I'd really love to be able to do is follow up with you afterwards if you have any questions. So if you have any questions, then email them through to me at tom@syncopatelab.com, and I will keep an eye out for those, and hopefully we can have a longer discussion. And the other thing I'll just say is that obviously given the time zone, we are oriented towards New Zealand for today. So the broader sort of rules as code space is really international in its focus. But today I'm mainly thinking about New Zealand. That's not to say that a lot of the things that we're going to run you through couldn't apply in an international context. It's just to anchor you in what we're thinking about specifically. So my background is in law and public policy. I've been working in that area for more than 10 years, and I started my career actually working outside of government and trying to look at how government systems work and understand why they were working or not working. Since then, I've been working more in tech policy and regulation more specifically. And that's been through a think tank and public interest consultancy called the Brainbox Institute. We've had a series of clients in the public sector, so New Zealand government agencies, for example, where we've sort of worked over long periods of time. And importantly, the key takeaway is that I've kind of worked outside government, I've worked sort of inside government and alongside government. So I have a good sense of the kind of subject area that I'm going to talk to you about today. My co-founder at Syncopate Lab is Hamish Fraser, and he has a more than 20-year career in software development, and then also thinking about policy implementation in a digital context. He ran a software company and still runs a software company called Verb, which is focused on digital civic infrastructure. And Hamish has had experience in local government and central government. So the rules as code sort of topic area really came to international attention through sort of a unit within the Department of Internal Affairs in New Zealand called the Service Innovation Lab. And Hamish was a member of that lab along with a number of other very influential people in this space. And he was responsible for taking law and turning it into computer code. So Hamish has also got that experience sort of working outside government, inside government, and alongside government. One day I was on Twitter and I saw Hamish tweeting about a particular act that I worked with all the time and I kind of knew inside out. And I'd been thinking a lot about the way that this act worked or didn't work and the way that it was implemented and the effects that it was having on people. And when I saw him tweeting about the sort of digital structure of this act, I immediately reached out. We started a conversation, and what that led to was some legal research that was funded by the New Zealand Law Foundation, where we tried to unpack what is this thing, rules as code? What does it mean to turn legislation into software code? What are some of the risks? What are some of the benefits? And what's the potential in this space? That led to a research report we published in 2021, where we reached some conclusions which we've more recently kind of reiterated in a publication that I'm going to run you through today, that was published in the MIT Computational Law Review. Something to take away from kind of Hamish and I's shared experience in this area is there's a few big picture themes that I want you to bear in mind as we're running through the presentation today. So one really big picture theme that you'll all be aware of, there's probably something in the news about it today, is around the regulation of digital systems. And what I mean, computers, the regulation of computers and the impact that they have on our lives and integration with other systems. And the top line examples there are sort of social media would be one really big example, obviously artificial intelligence. And then another example that's sort of coming to the fore in New Zealand as well is around digital identity. Another interesting one is digital public infrastructure and the way that that sort of works in with our society. Something I've observed from the way that these digital systems are being regulated is that regulators are using a kind of hierarchy of different regulatory instruments. So it's not the case that they're just publishing like a single piece of legislation, and then that sort of deals with everything. Frequently, there's a top level piece of legislation or even multiple bits of legislation, and they kind of cascade down into regulations, secondary legislation, or even things that are kind of not quite legal in nature. So there might be codes of practice, there might be guidelines and other kinds of guidance. Or the other really big one here is technical standards as well, which are being developed by non-governmental bodies. The other sort of big picture theme and the reality that I think most people will be familiar with, but not really think about on a regular basis, is that when it comes to regulation nowadays, digital systems are a fundamental part of the way that we design, create, publish, implement, and comply with regulation. It's difficult to think of a regulatory context that doesn't in some way involve the use of a digital system. It's obviously not the same in every part of the law, but certainly when it comes to kind of day-to-day in and out regulatory behavior, digital systems are fundamental and they're woven through the entire regulatory stack. This is where the kind of rules as code piece comes in, and at a high level, it sort of broadly asks, how can we better integrate law and digital systems, including through turning rules into computer code? Despite all of this, we still kind of treat law and regulation as if it's paper-based. And obviously, we do kind of digitize law and regulation. We publish PDFs rather than printing things out. And we will publish stuff to a website rather than, again, printing things out. But ultimately, we're kind of only halfway there in terms of treating law and regulation as data sets. We still kind of treat them as documents that could be printed at any moment, and that would be the kind of primary way that they're actually used. And we know that that's not the case. We're always using law and regulation in computers, and we're doing increasingly complex things with it. Another sort of easy touchstone here is think about the amount of time you've probably wasted copying and pasting text out of a PDF into some other format, like a word browser or something like that. We just don't need to keep working in that way. So the final big picture theme is that this better integration of law and digital systems is unavoidable. It's happening, it's only going to happen more, and it's actually essential because digital systems are very powerful and we need to have democratic oversight, and they need to be subject to the rule of law in the way that they're developed and deployed. So as I say, we've been thinking about this based on my experience in tech policy and the work that Hamish and I have done together and how you digitize law and regulation. And we summarized all that into a report that was published in the MIT Computational Law report. You can see on the screen there the copy that was published on the MIT website, but then also in the bottom left, we have our .ref version, which I'm going to run you through later. But basically, you can go on there, you can read it, you can annotate it, you can tag it, and you can share particular pinpoint links to individual paragraphs. And it's an interesting example of the way that you can make better use of documentation. So what I'd like to do is just sort of pause now and run you through the big picture here when it comes to rules as code. And I'm going to issue a disclaimer at the start that if it all starts getting a bit technical, if it hasn't already, then it's okay. We're going to get through it and we'll come back to the kind of high level summary. It's an interesting exercise talking about this stuff because it touches on law, technology, and public policy. And people who can work across all three of those tend to be relatively rare. And everybody's sort of experts in their own field. So if you're getting lost, don't stress. We'll come back to something you can hold on to. So in the kind of initiation of the rules as code space, there tended to be a particular way of working. And the way of working would be taking a single statute or a set of rules and then trying to take the text of those rules and turning them into computer code. And sometimes that would be a very direct, almost translation. So you can imagine an example where somebody is applying for a social welfare entitlement and their age has to be below a certain level or their income has to be below a certain level. You can easily imagine the way that rules tend to be quite formulaic in the way that they're drafted. So the notion that you could use computers to apply a rule to a set of data kind of makes sense to a lot of people. That's how we think about what rules are and what we think law is. In reality, it's not that simple. Law is much more complicated than that. Law is inherently about natural language. It's about how we talk to each other. And it's about how the meaning of words can shift and change over time in different contexts. In reality, when you're thinking about a particular area of the law, at any one time, you're likely to be drawing on multiple sources of the law. As I mentioned, you're likely to have legislation or even multiple pieces of legislation, some of which you might be drawing on without even realizing it. You're adopting a particular approach to the way that you interpret the law and how you understand what it actually means in a particular context. And then from there as well, rather than just creating a single rule set in code, frequently what you'll be doing is creating multiple digital outputs. So there might be something that's a data set, there might be something that is a bit of software, and there might be something that is more of a data structure where you're sort of submitting data into a particular format. This is important because the result of our research was that we need to lean into the fact that law is this interpretive exercise, and we need to be transparent about the interpretations that we're making of the law. And we need to be able to explain those to people if they want an explanation or if they're trying to challenge a particular decision. That's really important because of the potential risks of things like automated decision-making systems. And we've seen lots of examples over time, for example, such as the Australian robo-debt inquiry, where automated systems had huge impacts on people. And we've seen this in multiple jurisdictions, including in Denmark as well. What we do in our report is we kind of explain that core principle. And then what we do is we look to the regulation of artificial intelligence to try and understand what we can learn from that. And then we also suggest some particular ways for sort of governing, designing, developing, and deploying what we think of as digital legal systems. They're systems that are digital in nature and legal in nature, and they perform very complex tasks, very powerful tasks that need to be analyzed carefully. One of the things that we've taken away from our work is that not only is this conceptual approach not necessarily dominant, people don't tend to understand it, but equally the tools available for doing that kind of work are not available. And that's why what we've been doing is sort of speaking more about the approach that as we understand it, and then developing the tools necessary for doing the work. What I'm going to do now is run you through a quick example that we have done in a real life context. And this was a really exciting project. It was really forward thinking of Taumata Arawai, the drinking water regulator, to think about how to digitally implement a set of rules, which I'm going to run you through here. So what you have on the page in front of you is secondary legislation. It's something that is the law. It was passed under primary legislation, and essentially it does a few things. It says all drinking water suppliers in New Zealand must monitor for particular things, as you can see in this particular column here. They need to assess whether they're compliant with a series of sort of maximum values over a particular period of time. And then they need to tell the regulator about their compliance at different intervals. You can see the rules are numbered for referencing purposes. And you can see that this rule set is nearly 87 pages and includes about 42 different tables. The reality of the way that this is actually done in practice is that many of the larger suppliers will be using computer systems to do all the monitoring of water. They will then be generating large data sets, and then they will be submitting those in part to the regulator. So you kind of, even on the regulator side too, you will have the regulator analyzing those data sets using computer systems. So we have a full kind of digital system for the analysis, reporting, and then and collection of data. But the instrument that sort of governs how this should be done is this PDF. The other thing I mentioned is that you will at any one time be working with kind of multiple sources of law. And in this case, the drinking water quality assurance rules had a lot of information in them, but some other information was included in a whole other legal instrument. That was the drinking water standards, which, as you can see, are largely sort of table-based as well, and include numbers and things like units that tell you, how you should be calculating the amount of aluminium in water. What we did through working over a long period with Taumata Arawai and working really closely with them was we took all of this complexity in these regulatory instruments and we converted them into a spreadsheet. And the reason that was useful is because of the infrastructure it creates and the flexibility of the data that it creates for you to do all kinds of cool things with. That data set now sits as the back end to a rule builder. So rather than working your way through the 87-page PDF, we're able to do cool stuff with law as data. So people can basically describe themselves using this rule builder. They can indicate how many people they serve. They can elect to comply with other modules as they go. And the rule builder will just tell them which modules apply to them. Underneath the rule builder, you can also present all of the relevant information in the rule set to people in ways that are immediately useful to them. So for example, rather than viewing the rules by the modules that they are in within the rules, you can view the rules as it applies to your own supply component, for example, a particular bit of a water supply. Then you can filter the rules by only the ones that need to be reported or by all of the rules. And then you can do other interesting things in terms of digital implementation. Here, what Hamish has done is created something that generates a SQL query that can be used with other data sets. And again, it just presents all of the rules to you by their reporting period at the bottom. When you click on one of these rules, again, it extracts all the relevant information, puts it in front of you, and it's all ready for you to use. And interestingly as well, and probably the key point in terms of this interpretation flow, is you can trace the source for any particular point in the data set back to the original rule set. So here I mean legal source rather than source water. So you can actually trace back to the drinking water quality assurance rules, DWQAR, exactly where that compliance requirement has come from. Again, Hamish is able to use that data set to then generate a sample report. So this is what a report would look like, and it would be sent to the regulator via an API. If that doesn't make sense to you, that's okay. What it means is basically it's a structured front door for sending stuff that doesn't need to go via Excel spreadsheets or by another PDF. So I mentioned that it was going to get complex for a bit there. I hope you're all with me, and if you're not, then that's probably on me, not you. But what are the big takeaways here? Rules as code is a very exciting area. However, it needs a particular conceptual approach, and it needs a particular set of tools in order to do it properly and to do it safely. What our takeaway has been from working in this area and looking at this topic is that if you're ever going to be creating digital systems for implementing the law, i.e. rules as code, you're going to be dealing with multiple sources of law and regulation at any one time. You're very likely to be producing multiple different kinds of digital outputs, and all of those outputs really need to be traceable to the legal source. That's really important for maintaining it if the law changes, explaining it if it's challenged, or auditing it independently. There's a real potential here to improve the way that we publish law to make it easier for digital analysis. I showed you the PDF and then I showed you what we did with it. What I'm going to show you next is the way that DocRef could have skipped a lot of that work by making the law available in digital formats at the outset. There's also significant potential for better direct digital implementation of law through rules as code. And as we've shown you, I think there's really significant potential for any regulatory system, not just related to drinking water, where the primary mechanism is the collection and reporting of digital data. And if you think about that, that covers a lot of modern regulation. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a live demo of our DocRef platform. While I shift, I just want to throw to Hamish. Hamish, is there anything that you want to clarify from what I've just run through?
No, I think that was good. Perhaps just I'd like to stress the difficulty that we had in matching that data set with the PDF, essentially, and the which is the underlying inspiration for this DocRef approach. We did do that. We were able to reference every cell in that spreadsheet back to its source, and we were also able to describe how we'd interpreted it, whether it was direct or whether it needed massaging to make it work with the system. And that essentially allowed Tamala Arawai as well as the regulator to issue clarifications around the rules where they needed to fit it better to the model.
Thanks, Hamish. I think one other thing that I've found quite interesting about this work is publishing law is one thing, and there's a lot of opportunities we'll cover later to make law easier to use for the public. But the other thing is the benefits that you get from having a better sort of internal knowledge asset to work with as well. So I know a lot of policy people and operational people will be dealing with sort of spreadsheets and Word documents and PDFs that are sort of attached to email or at best sort of included in a SharePoint folder. When actually the ability to have this sort of integrated digital regulatory infrastructure just makes it a lot easier to sort of grapple with the volume and complexity of material that you might be dealing with on a daily basis. So what we've developed here is called DocRef, and that's because, as we've mentioned, a core thing in rules as code is two things. One, being able to better trace the digital implementation that you're working with back to its legal source, i.e. referencing. And then the other thing is just better tools for working with regulation, full stop. So anybody that works in policy or law has usually thought to themselves, surely there's a better way. I know that there's people in tech policy at the moment that are sort of copying whole bits of delegated regulation into a Google Doc and trying to sort of collaborate around that. and it's just a mess. It's not designed for that purpose, and it's not a sort of useful asset over time. So what we do with DocRef is we take a piece of legislation. So here we have the customer and product data bill that's going to regulate digital systems, i.e. the consumer data right that applies to things like banks. We pull this directly from the Parliamentary Council website and we turn it into our own love letter data format, which Hamish has described in a blog called a love letter to the Parliamentary Council of the World, which has really taken off. What we do is we assign a unique identifier to individual granular blocks. So at the moment on most legislation publishing sites, the most granular that you can go to is a whole section. So I could share a link with you to a section and it will take you to that whole section. With DocRef, we've gone very, very granular. So here you can see we have part 1, section 3, para 1b. We can edit these to make them even more human readable. So I'll show you some examples of that shortly. And what we do is we add that unique identifier to a URL. And what that means is that I could share this URL with you and it would take you directly to this paragraph. This gets very, very granular. So what we have here is a unique identifier to a bullet point in a table cell, in a subsection, in a section, in an act. So the ability to do this really pinpoint granular referencing is a significant benefit of what we're working on. And you can include those links and those references in code. So if you're writing code to implement a particular bit of law, you can include multiple links to the source so that people can understand what you've been doing. You can include these links in other documents. So for example, we do a lot of cross-referencing between different documents. And you can also include them in written materials too. So if you're writing a policy paper or a rule set or a discussion document, instead of just sort of referring people to a whole section, which can be really long, you can refer them to a particular part of the relevant law. This gets really powerful what I'll do first is I'll show you our annotation tool. So this is obviously a bill at the moment. And so there is a consultation process happening around it. Because we have this data set format, what we can do is we can build tooling around it. So this is our current annotation and tagging tool. So you can imagine what we could do is I can change my name here, I can create an annotation, and I can start adding tags. So red, green, blue. I can then save my annotation immediately. And what this does is it saves it in your browser. So if you want to go and have a play with this, you can. It's fully private and we can't see what you're doing. In the future, we will have a cloud-based sort of login tool, which lets you collaborate with other people and save your annotations and do all kinds of things. You can immediately begin to filter by the tags that you've created. So if you're coming to grips with a particular bit of law, I know I want to sort of read a bit of law once. I want to make my notes and I want to tag it and then I never want to read it again. I just want to go back to my notes. You can do that using this. So editing annotations is very easy. You just click on it and make the edit. And then, yeah, you can make use of these tags immediately. The annotation sets can be saved to your computer. So you can export this to a JSON file and you can share it with other people. Soon we'll be doing this in the form of a spreadsheet as well, so you can work with your annotations separately. Then the other thing is that other people can import an annotation set too. So I can share something with Hamish. For example, we did some edits on our user guide, which is also in our docref format, and I could send him all of the edits that I needed him to make as a set of tagged annotations, and we could collaborate that way. So collaboration is something you can already do with docref if you're up for this sort of import-export stuff, and it'll be much easier in the future. And the other thing is that you can imagine how you could manage consultation processes using this annotation and tagging tool. Because we have the legislation as a data set, we can also do cool stuff like this. So we can run what programmers call a diff and everybody else probably calls track changes. And so what I'm showing you in front of you is two versions of the Social Security Act. On the left-hand side, we have an older version, and on the right-hand side, we have the newer version. Not much has changed between these different versions. So if I then filter only by what's changed, you can see that I can see that all that has changed between the versions is just an update to some monetary amounts. That's really useful because you don't have to review the whole act and try and work out what's changed. And it also illustrates another important point, which is that you can see here that this is a table, and I can link you to a table row or a table column, but there's all these ghost columns up here. And what they are is are situations where a column has been used for visual spacing. So you wouldn't see this online and you wouldn't see if it was printed. But what it's done is it's created a lot of complexity in the underlying data set, which is totally unnecessary. And I think that speaks to this other broader opportunity here, which is thinking about ways that we design and publish legal instruments in ways that are intended for this kind of use case and are very tidy in their source material. The other thing I'll add, because it's been a question that we've had a couple of times, is we're not manually numbering these things. We're doing this automatically. We would be very unhappy people if we had to do this manually. So Hamish has developed some amazing systems that basically do this automatically. The more structured the underlying data, the better, but we're also not limited to structured data inputs either. To give you a sort of maybe more relatable example, this is a document that was being negotiated by countries at the United Nations, and it's all about how you govern digital technologies. It went through, I think, 5 different drafts, and what we did is we converted them at each stage so you could see what had changed between drafts. Again, you can also use our annotation tool to keep track of why things might have changed. And when you annotate the instrument fully, you can also publish an annotated instrument. So I went through with some of the team members at Brainbox, and we annotated and tagged the Global Digital Compact. And what that means is if I want to come back and only look at things about encryption, I can click the encryption tag and it will just show me only what's relevant to what I'm working on, and shows the annotations and other tags too. The other point that I made is that you're not limited to just law and regulation. It can be any kind of document that you might want to do this with. And I think that's really important for sort of discussion documents or internal policy manuals. So you could be creating really complex interlinking document assets, and they could be much more useful internally. So this is an example using our own governing digital legal systems report that I mentioned at the start. Another example of doing this to make things more useful is where we've done this with a document called the Secondary Legislation Access Standards, published by the Parliamentary Council Office. You can see that this has been published as a website, which is very useful. It makes it easier than other things in terms of working with it. It's also been published as a PDF, which is very attractive and easy to read. But if I ever want to link to a particular paragraph, I can't do that with the existing systems. And importantly as well, I can link even to unnumbered paragraphs. So there's a way to actually reference things that you ordinarily wouldn't be able to reference, either with text or even verbally. I'm sure lots of you have been in situations where you've asked people to count down the number of paragraphs. So if you count down 1, 2, 3, 4 paragraphs, it's inefficient, it's annoying, and we think you don't have to do it anymore if you use docref. Here's another example using a set of rules that have been published in relation to the regulation of digital systems. So these Digital Identity Services Trust Framework rules have been published using a template in Microsoft Word that the Parliamentary Council Office has made available. Again, you can see that there's this shift towards standardization and better digitization of instruments. But again, there's no way for me using this PDF to link to specific sections, let alone specific definitions. And this is in a situation where we're regulating digital systems and everybody is almost certainly going to be using regulatory compliance systems for what they do. We have converted this into our docref format, so now you can refer to specific definitions, or you can go to all kinds of other sort of more granular elements. The last thing I'll show you is just kind of something funny. This is the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. It's a trade agreement that relates to digital systems and digital economy. And a lot was made of the fact that it was signed digitally, but this is the official copy. And you can see that it's got punch holes in it from where it's been scanned, and you can see the paper on the other side. We have largely digitized this and we'll be publishing it on docref soon. And we think it'll be a really useful asset. Hamish, is there anything I've missed in terms of features there that you want to cover before I jump to my slides?
I'll just make the point that the diffing tool is really an illustration of what I call a programmatic change log. So when you're building rules as code systems, maintaining them is a big ask, especially with changes in multiple instruments upstream from them. And so if you have a rules as code system and it's fully tagged to the source, when a new version of the document comes out, you can also get a data set of everything that's changed or been re-referenced, etc., which means automation of those rules as code systems could be vastly improved in knowing where to look, what areas you need to focus on. So while the diff is a pretty visual implementation, the real value there is those data sets that allow you to manage and maintain changes to inspire digital legal systems.
Thanks for that, Hamish. I always struggle to explain that when we're on track changes. That's really good. Can you see my slides? I think you can see my slides again. Yeah, cool. So with docref, essentially you can deploy documents as digital infrastructure. And I think you probably have a better sense now of what we mean by that. You've got this great sort of traceable, pinpoint referenceable document that's published as a web page, and you can do all kinds of interesting stuff with it now that it's data. One of the things that we're still working on, but should be relatively easy, is basically exporting to multiple formats. So I'll get into that a little bit more later, but you can imagine how you sort of have the one data set and you export to multiple formats from that one core data set. The other thing that we've tried to prioritize is basically making sure that handover and data portability is a core feature. So we don't want to be sort of locking people into using our systems. We think it's really important that law is sort of freely available and public. And so we've really prioritized the ability to basically hand things over and exit a kind of relationship with agencies because we think that's important. So I mentioned that we have got some real sort of immediate opportunities where we think we can make use of these systems too. And again, these are quite sort of tailored to a New Zealand context, but they also can be applied to governments in any real sort of rule of law jurisdiction. We're talking a lot to people in the US and the EU. So one immediate opportunity is around secondary legislation. So secondary legislation is legislation that's been made under other legislation, usually by an agency. So recently I showed you the secondary legislation access standards published by the Parliamentary Council Office. They have come out and they, in a nutshell, say you really need to be publishing in accessible formats and ideally as an HTML web page. We're able to do that with pinpoint links. The standards also say that you really need to be publishing all different versions of the law and you need to make it clear to people how the law has changed. As you can see, we can publish multiple versions of the law and we can show how it's changed using our diffing tools. And we can put that all in one place. There's also a lot of potential to interlink different secondary legislation. At the moment, it tends to be published as a PDF, and where you might expect to see a lot of links between different bits of law, you don't tend to see that as much when it comes to secondary legislation. And this is something that's really easy for us to add using docref. The other important point is that everything I've showed you on DocRef is really just a demonstration. So I mentioned Hamish's experience in sort of tech for a really long time. We can fully white label, customize, and present these instruments in lots of different ways. And I think it's going to be really important, for example, to make sure that it reflects a particular agency's design profile. So we can change fonts, we can change colors. It's easy for us to do once we have the instrument on DocRef. The other thing that the secondary legislation access standards require is thinking about the different publication requirements that exist in law, including sort of presentation to the House of Representatives, publication on the web, notification under the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. And once we have your document in our dataset format, it's really easy for us to basically automatically generate these notices and save a lot of time. So the secondary legislation access standards sort of apply now, but agencies are going to be surveyed about their compliance over time, and PCO will be reported on that. The second opportunity, as I've already kind of covered, is consultation. So I get endlessly frustrated by being presented with a PDF and ask for my comments on it at a very granular level. Instead, you can imagine that if you're publishing something on DocRef, people can, first of all, you can tag and annotate the document for your readers. For example, if I'm looking in response to a broader discussion document, but I'm only interested in privacy, for example, you can thread a privacy tag throughout the document, just so I only need to look at the bits that are relevant to me. Submitters can annotate and tag and then submit make their submission as a spreadsheet using the DocRef tool. And they can also collaborate around things. So one of the things that I'm seeing a lot of is people collaborating across borders, even on things that are out for consultation. And as I mentioned, sort of doing that in Google Docs or other tools that aren't really set up for the job. So there's a lot of opportunity around collaboration. The other thing to consider is the way that public submissions can then be published as annotation sets on documents. So you'll see on the sort of Parliament website or in response to other consultation processes, the agency then publishes all the submissions received. At the moment, that's a series of unrelated documents, and instead you could be publishing those as annotation sets. The next opportunity to consider is situations where regulation is kind of across multiple different areas, or even more importantly, across multiple different countries. So one example to think about here is data protection law, which, and eventually AI law too, which will sort of work across borders. So it might be that you expect PCO or a legislation publishing office to publish in a format similar to DocRef, but it seems unlikely that every different instrument that applies in multiple jurisdictions across multiple sort of subject areas is going to be in the same format. If you have DocRef, what you can do is you can take all that source documentation, put it into the same format, and link it all together in a way that's useful to you or useful to the people that you serve. So think about the fact that you might have sort of multiple bits of legislation from multiple jurisdictions. Then you might have sort of guidelines, standards, and things that are drafted by completely different people. And being able to work with those all in a single common format could add a lot of quality of life for everybody. The next opportunity to consider is actually doing rules as code and doing digital legal system design work. So rules as code is a significant undertaking, and we think the way in here is to be thinking about small pilot areas. Frequently, when it comes to sort of secondary legislation or other kind of implementation things, you can articulate relatively defined areas of law, and you can work with them in a way that isn't overwhelming. So we've had a lot of experience in kind of assessing scope creep and thinking about digital implementation. And we're ready to start making use of these tools in order to develop real world systems. So we would be basically helping to design, develop, and deploy a digital legal system. And the exciting thing with these sort of rules as code pilots and proofs of concept and these systems is you can get a lot of the benefits of automation that is currently attached to artificial intelligence and LLMs, but without needing to use artificial intelligence and LLMs. So I think that's something really important to consider in terms of efficiency, data protection, confidentiality, those kinds of things. The last opportunity is kind of related to some work that the Ministry of Regulation has been doing. And so the Ministry of Regulation published a series of quick guides on regulatory practice. The opportunity here is to think about this broader digital regulatory infrastructure. So you can imagine if you have a range of different documents that are accessible in this sort of highly referenceable format, that creates the potential for these really powerful knowledge assets to be used internally by agencies and also by the public. That supports things like regulatory stewardship, which is a really core focus. I joined a Ministry of Regulation webinar yesterday, and stewardship was something that came up repeatedly. And what they mean by that is how are we going to keep track of a broader regulatory system and make sure it's actually delivering in the way that it needs to? I can't imagine how to do that effectively without having a kind of interoperable, interlinked regulatory infrastructure that sort of underlies all of that. So there's a real big opportunity when it comes to stewardship of regulatory systems to have much, much better tools for things like engagement, communication, consultation, and then even getting into sort of compliance and enforcement. You can take a really systematic approach using this sort of common infrastructure. So, in terms of summing up, as you can see from the kind of sweep of what I've taken you through, digital regulation is really important and it's pervasive. That means that sort of better tools for doing digital regulation are inevitable. We need to do better at this. We've also shown you that there's a lot of opportunity to improve regulatory documentation and actually that there is pressure. There's an expectation now, as with the secondary legislation access standards, to do better. So there's a justification for it. It's now an expectation, not a nice to have. The other thing that we've sort of talked through is the way that digital implementation of the law can be a really transformative thing. So you can get the benefits of automation, you can get, you can sort of do more with less, and you can do, other exciting things that just flow from the fact that you're working with digital systems rather than paper. We're ready to work on projects like this now. That's been the purpose of sort of trying to explain to you the way that we're working on this and the tools that we've developed. And in the future, we'll have basically user-facing products like DocRef, which are available for you to sort of log in and use yourself. In the short term, what we're doing is working with clients on a project-by-project basis, and we're really keen to sort of put our tools to the test. So I think that's all from me. That's been a lot of words on this topic. I hope we've kept you all with us. Hamish, did you want to add anything else? And then we do actually have sort of a few minutes to spare. We might be able to do some questions.
The only other thing that was perhaps missed is the idea that these documents on DocRef, which are data sets, will also be available via REST APIs, which makes for integration with other systems and reproducing partial parts of the documents and things like that. That allows for some really interesting investigations in that space.
Thanks, Hamish. So what I'm going to do now is I'll just make it possible for people to unmute themselves, and you should all be able to raise hands. So do we have any questions from anybody? I'll turn the chat on too.
Sorry, couldn't find the hand up button.
Hi, welcome.
Thank you for the presentation. It was great. And as someone that has worked on how they act remediation. This is I wish this tool was existing back then, as a data analyst and as a data engineer. It would be great. But my question is, do you think also the government should also provide, for example, let's just take the how they act as an example. Should the government be giving logic or data logics on how to implement a payroll system for, let's just say, a private company? Besides
Yeah,
the data stuff as well.
great question. And I know that sort of Holidays Act stuff has been a really strong focus for a lot of people working in this space. Hamish, do you want to touch on that?
I did do an investigation on the Holiday Act work a few years ago, and I remember going, I never want to be anywhere near this. So all power to you. I think my experience from that too, in that particular sector, is there were just so many variations. I think government could provide some default implementations or reference implementations, but it would be pretty difficult from what I saw from that work to provide an exhaustive set of solutions. A lot of the problems were arriving from like custom contracts and old contracts with people with unique rule sets, which the government wouldn't necessarily have access to or be able to reference. And that creates lots of those outlying questions around, well, how do we interpret this? Which is where .graph would start to become useful, because you can start to link those interpretive decisions at that point.
Yeah, I think the other point that I'd add to that is having a reference implementation could be really useful, including sort of publishing things in digital formats ready to go straight into a digital system. But again, a core thing with our research and with the tools that we've developed is ensuring that whatever that is, it's clear that that is kind of an expression by the executive of the way it thinks the law works, and that should be able to be sort of challenged and tested and traced back to the source and updated over time. So that's where this broader sort of governance piece comes in. So yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of room for that. I've just seen we've got a couple of questions in the chat, so I'll run through those. Thanks, Matt. Yeah, so a couple about basically exporting to rules as code. This is where the kind of conceptual approach that we take is really important. So rules as code to me is always an interpretive exercise. So there might be some things where it's really easy to export to a digital format, like a threshold shouldn't be exceeded, and the line between the sort of legal source and the digital implementation is pretty incontrovertible. However, I do think that a lot of the time rules as code is an interpretive exercise. So we need to be doing that relatively manually. And the question is basically, how do you get better tools for the job to work faster on doing that manual interpretation work and committing it into formats that you can make use of and update over time? I think this is one of the things about rules as code that is both disappointing and also kind of reassuring. It's disappointing that we are going to have to do a lot of manual work, but it's also quite reassuring to think that people are going to be doing this carefully and in ways that are sort of open and useful. I think another thing for me when it comes to kind of rules as code formats is to come back to that notion that you might have multiple digital outputs from a particular area. So there's lots and lots of different ways to represent a rule set in some kind of digitally processable format. And I think where it can be difficult is where you try to have one format that does everything. There's always some kind of corners that need to be cut or something that sort of doesn't quite fit. So it's kind of liberating to be able to open up yourself to using the full toolkit of digital tools without necessarily having to be limited to a particular sort of domain-specific language or something like that. Unless Hamish has got anything to add on that one, I'll keep going through. So Roger, does regulation classify as secondary legislation? How does RSE interact with business rules engines? So those are two really great questions, which Hamish looks like he's answered. So yes, essentially, secondary legislation is the new cover-all kind of term for things like regulation. And so yes, secondary legislation is going to cover things like different regulations. And rules as code interacts awkwardly with business rules engines, but should interact better. One of the things that I know Hamish has spent a lot of time thinking about is how do you get things into business rules engines in ways that you can then get them back out again, because you don't want to be sort of locked into a particular system. And I think a lot of the promise of rules as code approaches is the ability to have these kinds of portable code bases you can kind of take with you. But business rules engines are a great example of the fact that actually we already do implement law in code a lot. There's a whole industry of governance, risk, and compliance software and business rules engines. A lot of the sort of benefits of a rules as code digital legal system approach is that you start to make all of that stuff transparent. That's something that I know the Service Innovation Lab crew thought about a lot when they were working. Thanks for your comment, Kay, about accessibility. I think that's a really important point. Chris, regarding where docref things are stored. Yeah, Hamish has covered that one. Where one sort of feature of what we're doing is we're trying to keep everything positive values-wise. So there's actually not any real tracking on the current docref website as an example. And as I mentioned, we're sort of prioritizing data portability. Jay Hunt, have we considered open sourcing docref? Absolutely. That would be really cool. And I think in the end, the love letter format and other stuff we're working on does need to be an open standard. The question for us is just a timing and prioritization kind of thing. We need to be able to continue funding development, basically. Thanks very much, Christine. Big fan of your work as well in the RMA digital space. And I think we're just up to time, which is great. Thanks for your comments, Rob. Yeah, so I think what we'll do is we'll call it there at 1 o'clock on the dot, which I'm quite pleased with. Thanks very much, everybody, for joining us and sort of sitting through a lot of complex stuff. As you can see, I think this is a really exciting space. There's a lot of opportunity and we're sort of ready to go. We've thought about this a lot, as you can tell, and we're really keen to sort of crack into some things. So if you spot any use cases, you have any questions, or you have some documents that you work with all the time that really grind your gears, please do reach out, send me an email, send Hamish an email. We're on Blue Sky, we're on LinkedIn, and looking forward to speaking with you. Thanks very much.